October 29th, 1977 was a cloudy, bleak Saturday in Columbia, South Carolina. 22-year-old Joseph Carl Shaw was cruising around town in his blue Camaro with 17-year-old James Terry Roach in the passenger seat next to him. In the back seat was 16-year-old Ronald Eugene Mahaffey. Mahaffey and Roach were both high on meth. All three had been drinking, and they had a .22 caliber rifle in their possession. Mahaffey would later testify in court that they had decided, quote, to go out and see if we could find a girl to rape. Their first thought was to go back to a woman's house that Mahaffey and Roach had broken into a few days earlier. But as they approached a recreational area called Polo Road Park, they spotted a white Oldsmobile Cutlass that was parked just off the road. A young man occupied the driver's seat, and with him was a pretty girl. Shaw, the oldest of the three predators in the Camaro and the group's de facto leader, made a snap decision. He pulled over and the three quickly formulated a plan. Shaw gave the rifle to Roach and told him what to do. My name is Michael, and this is the story of how three young men, two of them teenagers, committed what authorities would eventually call one of the most heinous crimes in the history of Richland County, South Carolina. And these three monsters, along with a fourth accomplice, would also take the life of an innocent young woman before targeting high school students Tommy Taylor and Carlotta Hartness. And in the end, this case would land one of the teenagers in a very exclusive club in terms of punishments, and you can probably guess where this is going. I will give details later on for sure. Sources and research notes are available at grimsilence.com, and if you're interested in true crime that's older and more obscure, please be sure to like and subscribe. Also, I have to warn you that this case gets pretty intense in some parts. The R word figures very heavily into it, and just please click away if you're not quite ready for that. Columbia is not only the state capital of South Carolina, it's also historic in that the city was founded in the 1800s and was an important location in the U.S. Civil War. Today, it is the state's second most populous city with about 140,000 residents, and it is home to the University of South Carolina, the state's largest public university. In 1977, Columbia was also home to Wildwood Academy, a very small private school of fewer than 100 students. Wildwood was located in the quiet northeastern part of town, just across the street from Polo Road Park and about a 15-minute drive from the nearby Fort Jackson Army Base. 40 minutes to the west of Wildwood and Polo Road Park was the John G. Richards School for Boys, a polite name for a state-run youth detention center. On October 9, 1977, 17-year-old James Terry Roach, whose criminal history included drugs, home robbery, and stealing his father's car, escaped from this detention facility with another 17-year-old by the name of Joey Mahaffey. Roach was from Seneca, South Carolina, a very small town located several hours away, so Joey took Roach to the mobile home park where he lived with his father and younger brother. Incidentally, this happened to be uncomfortably close to Wildwood Academy, Polo Road Park, and Fort Jackson. It was at this mobile home park that Roach would become acquainted with his fellow escapee's younger brother, 16-year-old Ronald Eugene Mahaffey. Roach and the younger Mahaffey hit it off and began spending time together. Not much is known about the younger Mahaffey's early years, but suffice it to say that at 16 years old, he was a frequent customer of a local drug dealer, 22-year-old Joseph Carl Shaw, who at one time lived in the same mobile home park that the Mahaffeys did. Much like Roach and Mahaffey, Shaw had a troubled past. His mother made mention of some sort of continuing trouble as a high school student in Kentucky, leading Shaw's own mother to encourage him to drop out in the 10th grade. But he got married on his 18th birthday, joined the Army, and life was actually looking pretty good for Shaw until his wife walked out on him a year and a half into their marriage. Now, up to this point, friends and family said that Shaw hadn't really been in any trouble with the law and seemed well adjusted. But after his marriage fell apart, Shaw would really start to spiral out of control. Following his divorce, Shaw began dating and, just like his wife had, his girlfriend suddenly left him. Shaw was arrested on drug possession charges, resulting in him being denied a promotion in the military, and he was also relieved of his duties as a military police officer at nearby Fort Jackson, where he was stationed. As Shaw's whole life essentially crumbled around him, his dependence on drugs and alcohol grew stronger, as did his pent-up hostility, which was largely directed at women. Meanwhile, his mental health would deteriorate to the point where he would claim to have bizarre hallucinations, such as hearing voices and believing that a flock of birds overhead was a squadron of bombers. Shaw would also attempt to end his own life on 2 different occasions. On the night of October 18th, 9 days after Roach had fled from the John G. Richards School for Boys, Roach was with Shaw in Shaw's blue Chevy Camaro. They were driving around the Fort Jackson area, and riding with them was 16-year-old Ronald Mahaffey, the younger brother Roach had met after his escape, as well as 21-year-old Robert Neal Williams, one of Shaw's fellow soldiers from Fort Jackson. Williams was drunk and the others were high, and the 4 of them were on the hunt, looking to R-word the first lone woman they could find. With a stolen .22 caliber rifle that Shaw had bought a few days earlier for $30, they fired a shot from the Camaro at a car that was driving down Percival Road, which runs right past the Polo Road Park area. The car they fired at with the rifle sped away instantly, and then they spotted a young woman driving a Mercury Capri, and she appeared to be alone. Williams, Shaw's army buddy, managed to shoot out one of the tires, prompting the driver to pull over and take a look at the damage. 21-year-old Betty Swank thought she had a blown tire, which honestly she did, but she didn't realize that it was the result of a gunshot. Swank immediately walked up to a nearby home and started knocking on the door, presumably to ask to use the phone. By this point, Shaw, Roach, Mahaffey, and Williams had circled back and pulled up behind Swank's car. Now, Swank, thinking that someone had stopped to offer help, went back to her car where Shaw, Roach, and Mahaffey were waiting for her. Williams remained in the back seat of the blue Camaro. Swank explained that she was on her way to work and that she needed to call her husband for help. Shaw seized the opportunity and offered to take the woman to work, and not wanting to be late, Swank accepted and climbed into the back seat of Shaw's car, and in doing so, she had unwittingly sealed her own fate. Shaw then drove to a remote area where the 4 men stripped and R-worded Betty Swank, assuring her that she wouldn't be otherwise harmed. When it was over, they let her out of the car near Lakewood Mobile Home Park along Percival Road where her tire had been shot out. Betty Swank might have survived that night if Joseph Carl Shaw hadn't realized that he knew this woman's husband. Swank's husband was a military police officer at Fort Jackson, as Shaw had once been, and Shaw feared that Swank would be able to identify him later. Shaw told Williams, who had the rifle, that he needed to kill Swank. According to court testimony, Williams said he just couldn't do it. Now, let's not mistake this for a stark refusal, as if Williams were horrified by the thought of killing an innocent woman. Based on his tepid response, Williams perhaps considered it, and let's not forget that he had literally R-worded this poor woman probably minutes before. But he simply didn't have it in him to kill her. As Betty Swank began walking, Shaw hit the gas and departed the scene as he argued with his companions about who would kill the woman they had just put through hell. Deciding that he would have to do the dirty work himself, Shaw eventually circled back, and he turned the car so that it was positioned sideways behind Swank so that the driver's side was closest to her. Swank turned around as Shaw aimed the rifle. She cried out, "Oh my God," as Shaw pulled the trigger. Despite having just been shot in the stomach, Swank turned and ran for her life. Shaw fired 3 more times, hitting her once in the arm. An oncoming car scared Shaw into fleeing the scene once again, and Betty Swank kept running. She made it as far as the entrance to the nearby mobile home park before collapsing on the sidewalk. Her lifeless body was discovered early the next morning. In the days that followed the cold-blooded murder of Betty Swank, Joseph Carl Shaw claimed that he began hearing voices and hallucinating, something he had experienced before. According to Shaw, he went to the mental health clinic at Fort Jackson and asked for tranquilizers and to see a counselor, and he was told that he didn't need tranquilizers, nor did he need counseling. A receptionist at the mental health clinic said that Shaw came in twice on October 28th, the day before Shaw and company would target Tommy Taylor and Carlotta Hartness. On the 28th, Shaw told the clinic that he needed to see a psychiatrist and wanted to be, quote, put on the ward, apparently trying to commit himself into psychiatric care. A counselor talked with him for 15 minutes, after which Shaw was dismissed. And later that same day, Shaw returned to the clinic telling the receptionist, "I've got to see somebody, and I'm afraid of what might happen." The receptionist politely explained that all of the professional staff were in the backyard behind the building having a beer and hot dog party. At Shaw's insistence, the receptionist interrupted the party and got another counselor to talk with Shaw for another 15 minutes, and then Shaw was once again sent on his way. The next morning, on October 29, 1977, Shaw joined Roach and Mahaffey to start their day by fueling up with drugs and alcohol. Shaw got high, probably smoking weed, while Roach and Mahaffey allowed a drug dealer named Doc to inject them with some form of methamphetamine called crystal tea. Then, after having lunch at a fast food restaurant, the trio set out to find their next victim. Meanwhile, 17-year-old Tommy Taylor was getting ready to spend the day with a 14-year-old girl named Carlotta Hartness. Tommy Taylor and Carlotta Hartness were both Wildwood Academy students, Wildwood being that private school near Polo Road Park, not far from Fort Jackson and Percival Road where Betty Swank had been murdered, and unfortunately also close to the mobile home park where Ronald Mahaffey lived. Tommy was a sophomore at Wildwood and wore number 19 on the school's football team where he played halfback. He also played basketball and baseball, and in addition to that, he was also a member of the Key Club, an international leadership organization for high school students. Tommy Taylor had a bright future ahead of him. Harry Crosby, who had taught Tommy in the 7th grade, described the boy as a lovable fellow because he was so easy to get along with. There ain't nobody who disliked Tommy Taylor. Tommy's close friend, Carlotta Hartness, was a freshman at the school and was also heavily involved in athletics. She played both volleyball and basketball, and she was also a cheerleader. As a freshman, Carlotta was named to the homecoming court, which would be a big deal for any high school kid. Carlotta was certainly popular and well-liked. And I'll explain briefly for those who don't know. Homecoming is a high school tradition in North America that takes place in the fall. It's a big event, usually taking place over a week, and it culminates in a semi-formal dance. Jim Childers, the school's football coach and science teacher, once said of Carlotta, "She was just as sweet as could be, always in a good mood and very personable. She got along with everybody." Both of them did, of course referring to Tommy Taylor as well. At about noon on October 29th, probably while Shaw, Roach, and Mahaffey were still getting high, Tommy Taylor jumped in his father's white Oldsmobile Cutlass and went to pick up Carlotta Hartness. Taylor had a history paper to write, which entailed visiting some local places in nearby Camden, also a city steeped in South Carolina history, to gather research, and Hartness was joining him to help him take notes. Both Taylor and Hartness were told by their parents to be home before dark, and the pair happily set off to spend the day together. It was autumn, their high school homecoming dance was just a week away, and perhaps there was more between these two than just friendship. Tommy Taylor wasn't some dumb jock. He was a smart kid and certainly capable of taking notes for himself, but his friend Carlotta chose to spend her Saturday with him nonetheless. The two did, in fact, go to Camden and collect their research. Later in the day, somewhere around 4:30 p.m., the pair made that fateful stop near Polo Road Park, just steps away from their school. Shaw, Roach, and Mahaffey, as mentioned earlier, were out looking for a victim to R-word. They were less than 2 weeks removed from R-wording and killing Betty Swank, and as they always seemed to be, they were in the vicinity of Polo Road Park and Wildwood Academy. After spotting Taylor and Hartness in their parked car, Shaw gave the rifle to Roach, who sat in the front passenger seat. They acted out exactly what they would do upon pulling up to the white Oldsmobile Cutlass, and then Shaw started driving. Out of either an abundance of caution or perhaps a sense of paranoia, Shaw drove back and forth several times. In Ronald Mahaffey's words, they rode back and forth to make sure nobody would see what was going on. Now, this is where I want to warn you that things are about to get heavy. If you want to skip it, you can jump forward to about the 20-minute mark. Then Shaw drove his blue Camaro up next to Tommy Taylor's car so that they were on Taylor's left side. Roach propped the rifle up on the car window and ordered the teens to hand over their money. At the same time, Mahaffey took Taylor's car keys while Shaw exited the Camaro to get Carlotta Hartness. He ordered her to get out of Taylor's car, and he then put her in the back seat of the Camaro where Mahaffey was sitting. Then Shaw got back in the car and said to Roach, "Okay, now." James Terry Roach fired 3 shots at Taylor from close range, and then Shaw sped away with Roach, Mahaffey, and a terrified Carlotta Hartness. They warned her not to scream or try to get the attention of other drivers on the road. They drove until they reached a secluded dirt road in a wooded area near Percival Road, the very same road where they had murdered Betty Swank. Hartness was ordered to undress, while Shaw, Roach, and Mahaffey discussed who would R-word her first. Shaw, generally understood to be the leader of the gang, went first, and he did so while telling Roach and Mahaffey not to look. While this assault took place, Mahaffey buried Tommy Taylor's wallet nearby. All 3 would R-word Hartness, Shaw doing so multiple times. Afterward, apparently to the surprise of Roach and Mahaffey, Shaw asked who wanted to shoot the girl. According to testimony by Ronald Mahaffey, he and Roach wanted no part of this. Roach, however, relented and took the rifle. Hartness pleaded for her life. She said that her mother would pay them handsomely for her safe return. In Mahaffey's words, and I'm quoting here, "She said her mama loved her too much for her to die." Shaw ordered Hartness to put her head face down in the dirt. She refused. Mahaffey testified, "She just kept looking at us and telling us not to shoot her." Shaw, at this point, getting frustrated, drew a circle in the dirt with an X in the middle of it. He again ordered Carlotta Hartness to put her head face down. Again, she wouldn't do it. It wasn't until Shaw started yelling that she finally complied. Mahaffey said that he was in the car when the shots rang out. He didn't witness the actual shooting, but he saw Roach holding the rifle when the shooting stopped. Hartness's body began to shake and convulse. Mahaffey testified, quote, "J.C., meaning Joseph Carl Shaw, J.C. said she wasn't dead, and he grabbed the rifle and shot her twice more." At this point, the 3 of them decided to head back to Polo Road Park to make sure that Tommy Taylor was dead. They had left the park in a hurry and had only seen Taylor rocking back and forth before fleeing the scene. Along the way, they disposed of the rifle and a box of ammunition by throwing them into the woods. Upon arriving at Taylor's car where they had left the 17-year-old for dead, the 3 were oddly frightened to look at the boy's dead body in the car, their own handiwork. After agreeing that they would all look at the same time, they confirmed that he was indeed deceased, and then they casually headed over to Fort Jackson to buy beer and snacks with money taken from Taylor's wallet, which, according to news reports, amounted to all of $5. And later that night, Shaw would return to where they had left Hartness's body. News reports described what he did to her as mutilation, which is true, but also misleading. Court documents describe his actions in much more graphic detail, which will not be shared here. But I can assure you that what he did to the body of that 14-year-old girl was shockingly grotesque. In Columbia, South Carolina, at the end of October and before daylight savings time ends, the sun usually sets around 6:30 p.m. By 7:30, the parents of Tommy Taylor and Carlotta Hartness were getting worried. Nobody had heard from the teenagers, and it was well past the be home by dark deadline that the two kids were typically very good about honoring. There were no reports of car accidents, and school friends didn't know where they were, so one of the parents picked up the phone and called the Richland County Sheriff's Office to report Tommy and Carlotta missing. In the early morning hours of Sunday, October 30th, police officers discovered Tommy Taylor's body slumped over in his father's white Cutlass at Polo Road Park. He was wearing his number 19 Wildwood Warriors football jersey, and he had been shot twice in the face. Knowing that Carlotta Hartness was also missing but still nowhere to be found, police launched a massive search operation. The Sheriff's Department plane searched from the air, while SLED, the State Law Enforcement Division of South Carolina, put their resources to work on the ground. The FBI was called in because of the strong possibility that a kidnapping had taken place, and around 500 citizens joined the search that day, hoping to locate the missing girl. That afternoon, about 10 hours after Tommy Taylor had been discovered murdered in his car, the body of Carlotta Hartness was discovered 7.5 miles from the spot where she had been torn away from her friend Tommy. Carlotta was found face down in the dirt on a lonely backwoods road. Her clothes were underneath her exposed body, Shaw's disgusting acts of abuse clearly evident, and she had been shot 5 times in the head. Public reporting isn't entirely clear on the timeline of events after Tommy Taylor and Carlotta Hartness were murdered, but at some point, Shaw, Roach, and Mahaffey met up with Robert Williams, who had been part of the R-word and murder of Betty Swank. It's unknown what they were doing together, but more drugs and alcohol seems like a reasonable guess. Then the 4 of them split up. Shaw and Williams went off on their own to do God knows what, while Roach and Mahaffey went to the home of Mahaffey's grandmother, who lived west of Columbia in Saluda County. Both Ronald Mahaffey and his older brother Joey, Roach's fellow escapee from the juvenile detention center, were apparently spending that weekend at Grandma's. And at this time, the Mahaffey's grandmother had a visitor from Georgia, Mrs. J.B. Black, and Mrs. Black was visiting and staying overnight. And while Mrs. Black was sleeping, she heard someone come into her room at about 2 a.m. to take her purse and the keys to her new 1977 Chevrolet Caprice. The Mahaffey brothers got in the car with Roach and drove off. And with that, Mrs. Black reported her car stolen to the police, and warrants were issued for the 2 17-year-olds, the older Mahaffey and Roach. And since the police already knew that Roach was from Seneca, several hours away in Oconee County, they informed sheriff's deputies there to be on the lookout. After stealing Mrs. Black's car, the 3 teens apparently went joyriding in a muddy construction zone somewhere near the spot where they had killed Tommy Taylor, which is where Mrs. Black's car would later be found. Then Roach and the Mahaffey brothers took a taxi all the way to Seneca, about 3 hours away. Now, this was an unusually long ride and an unusually big fare for any taxi driver. When the Mahaffeys and Roach reached Seneca, they ran off without paying the driver. And naturally, the taxi driver was furious and immediately notified police. The Oconee County Sheriff's Department, already aware that the older boys had arrest warrants for auto theft, immediately arrested all 3 of them. Roach's father paid the taxi driver, and then Saluda County authorities hauled them in for questioning about the car they had stolen from Mrs. Black. Now, keep in mind that the Saluda County Sheriff's Office had absolutely no idea that James Terry Roach and Ronald Mahaffey were murderers. To the officers, this was simply about a stolen car and nothing more. But while in custody, Ronald Mahaffey just couldn't keep his mouth shut. He didn't outright confess to what he had done with Shaw and Roach, but he made some very unexpected comments about Polo Road Park and the murders of Tommy Taylor and Carlotta Hartness. Mahaffey knew an awful lot about those tragic murders for a 16-year-old degenerate. The Saluda County officers, who were obviously aware of the horrifying double murder of Taylor and Hartness, immediately became suspicious. They notified Richland County authorities, who had been fielding hundreds of tips called in, but they still had not made any arrests. But what they had done, up to this point, was locate the rifle and ammunition that was disposed of less than a mile from where Carlotta Hartness had been found face down on that dirt road. They had also traced the purchase of the ammunition back to Joseph Carl Shaw, who had bought it on base at Fort Jackson, where he was still a soldier, and they had Shaw under surveillance. Richland County authorities were hoping to trick Shaw into trying to recover the rifle he had dumped by announcing on the news and to newspapers that investigators would soon be searching the area for a murder weapon. But that bait hadn't yet been released to the media, and the Richland County authorities simply didn't have enough evidence to charge Shaw with murder. After Saluda County Police informed Richland County deputies of Mahaffey's unusual statements, it wasn't long until the younger Mahaffey was telling Richland County Sheriff's deputies everything. Taylor and Hartness had been murdered on Saturday, and by Wednesday, Roach and Mahaffey were charged with murder, rape, and armed robbery, and Shaw and Williams would soon be joining them. Williams was not present on the day that Taylor and Hartness were killed, but he was charged, along with the other three, with the rape and murder of Betty Swank. These arrests were made during the week leading up to the Wildwood Warriors homecoming football game. With the school and the whole community grieving, homecoming festivities had been canceled. There would be no homecoming dance, no pep rallies, no voting for the high school's homecoming king and queen. But there would be a football game because the parents of Tommy Taylor and Carlotta Hartness insisted on it. In much of the United States, and especially in the South, American football is practically a religion, so the Wildwood Warriors of Columbia, South Carolina, suited up for their clash with crosstown rivals Heathwood Hall. The Wildwood Warriors gave everything they had, but Heathwood finished on top with a final score of 24-12. And when the final whistle blew, signaling that the game was officially over, a bunch of the Wildwood players burst into tears. They had wanted so badly to win this game, to honor the memories of Tommy Taylor and Carlotta Hartness, classmates they had lost in a brutal and senseless crime just a week earlier. Tommy Taylor had been a member of the team, and Carlotta Hartness had been a cheerleader, and the football team, along with the entire school, was absolutely devastated. Carlotta's parents had left the game at halftime after the team presented Carlotta's mother with a bouquet of flowers. It was also announced that Carlotta, a member of the homecoming court, was posthumously named Homecoming Queen, a heartfelt and very touching tribute by the students. Tommy's parents, being avid fans of the Wildwood Warriors football team, decided to stay throughout the game to cheer on their deceased son's teammates. When the game was over, Tommy's father, Earl Taylor, consoled the grief-stricken players. He patted the kids on the shoulders, he congratulated them on playing hard, and he bear-hugged one player who was sobbing uncontrollably. He told the boy, "You played a great game. You looked like a pro out there." And then Earl Taylor, whose son had been murdered in cold blood just a week earlier, continued to console his dead son's friend, putting his arm around the boy as they left the field together. Hidden away from the sweet tributes and enormous pain at Wildwood, Shaw, Roach, and Mahaffey languished in their jail cells as they awaited their fates. And before long, they learned that they would all be facing the death penalty for what they had done. Mahaffey quickly struck a deal with prosecutors to testify against Shaw and Roach on the condition that he wouldn't be sentenced to death. Neither Shaw nor Roach had any such agreements in place. But Shaw and Roach, in a very surprising move, also pleaded guilty. Rather than risk facing the wrath of 12 angry jurors who would almost certainly condemn them to death, they decided to roll the dice and try to appeal to just one judge instead. By pleading guilty, they put their fates entirely in the hands of the judge, who could impose any sentence that fit their crimes, including death. During the sentencing hearings, Ronald Mahaffey provided lengthy, detailed testimony that was so graphic and disturbing that many courtroom observers began sobbing. Mahaffey was calm and composed for the most part, occasionally breaking into tears himself when describing the worst of what he and his fellow defendants had done. After careful consideration by the judge, both Joseph Carl Shaw and James Terry Roach were sentenced to death for the murders of Tommy Taylor and Carlotta Hartness, with additional penalties for armed robbery, conspiracy, and SA. For the group's crimes against Betty Swank, Shaw, Roach, Mahaffey, and Williams were all sentenced to life plus 40 years. Mahaffey, who was also sentenced for his part in the murders of Taylor and Hartness, received a total of 3 life sentences plus 110 years. Shaw died in the electric chair on January 11, 1985. Roach, who was 17 when he was sentenced to death, drew the attention of the United Nations Secretary General, as well as Mother Teresa, both of whom called for mercy due to his age when he committed his crimes. But even they couldn't save him. Roach died in the electric chair on January 10, 1986, almost a year to the day after Shaw. And many will say that Roach's death was well-deserved, but one thing's for sure, it was historic in a very unfortunate way. Since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976, Roach had become only the second person to be executed for a crime that he committed as a minor. The first was Charles Francis Rumbaugh, who died by lethal injection in Texas for a murder he committed while robbing a jewelry store. I was unable to find any information on whether Robert Williams is still in prison or not. Despite his lengthy sentence, he would have been eligible for parole as soon as 1998, which is messed up, let's be honest. Ronald Mahaffey, though, Ronald Mahaffey died in prison in 2003 at the age of 41. These murders took place nearly 50 years ago, and I hope time has eased the pain of the families of Betty Swank, Tommy Taylor, and Carlotta Hartness. If you have any thoughts on this case, and in particular, if you have any thoughts on sentencing a 17-year-old to death, please be sure to let me know in the comments. Also, it's pretty striking to see the similarities between this case and that of Gary Lee Davis. Without giving too much away, both cases share quite a bit in common. They're extremely different, but yeah, a lot of the elements are very, very similar. And if you'd like to learn more about Gary Lee Davis, I will put a link up to that video right here, and I thank you for watching.